The sounds of rustling leaves and the trotting of his horse's hooves filled the air. The scent of the wood and the freshness of the breeze were more than welcome to this old knight. Even so, the pleasantries along this forest path did nothing to lift the weight on his guilty heart. He nudged his horse to the side of the path and dismounted. His armor creaked as he moved. He didn't make any other sound as he stepped away from his horse to rest against an ancient tree. He sat on an upturned root, his head hanging low in the shell of black iron that was his helmet. The only sounds that echoed within were those of his own memories, the screams, the pained pleas for help. The castle where the king and his family resided had been set ablaze. While the palace burned, this knight, this servant, once thought loyal to his majesty, ran away. A coward in a knight's armor. He should have stayed. He should have helped. He should have saved someone. But now here he sat, a black knight who had thrown himself into exile. He removed his helmet and furiously tossed it into the nearby stream. The noise of metal on stone caused his horse to whinny and rear. The knight got to his feet and went over to calm it down again, gently brushing its head with gentle shushes. He turned back to the shallow stream. The wet river rocks clattered loosely under the knight's metal boots. He picked up the helmet and shook off the water. The black metal didn't shine well in the sunlight. The bronze trim that highlighted the sharp edges of its wolf-like design barely gleamed. The rest of his armor also featured the same pattern, which was where his title, the Black Wolf, came from. The knight sighed as he put his helmet back on. His armor had been specially designed to impress any who looked upon it and intimidate his foes. Now it would be a looming shadow of a knight who failed himself, his king, and his kingdom. A wagon passed on the path nearby. The knight could feel the eyes of the riders on him. He returned to his horse and tried to ignore it as he heard the reins snap. The horse pulling the wagon quickened its pace down the road. At least the wagon was heading westward. Good. The knight's destination was the other way. Once the wagon was far enough away, the knight swung onto his horse and guided it eastward. Hopefully, there was no one else on the road that he could run into. A flock of crows called and flew away as the horse trotted past. The knight looked up to watch them as they flowed through the air like a river of black feathers. The small town came into view, its tan stone buildings rising above the road. He didn't want to go there. Too many people, too much attention. But he needed supplies before he did anything else. All he had with him was a purse filled with gold and a few pieces of bread. He left his horse at the public hitching post and paid a silver for the stable boy to keep watch. In town, he made his way to the market. He navigated through the crowds. Some people stared at him with wide eyes. Others turned away quickly. Behind his helmet, his eyes darted around, quickly scanning the crowds. A cold sweat trickled down his brow. Someone must know him. There may be a price on his head. He must be someone's target. The knight didn't bother haggling with the shopkeepers, just paid their prices and kept his head down. A few weeks' worth of supplies hung from one hand as he left the market square. He looked around at the people, who stepped out of his path at the sight of his helmet turning toward them. He sighed and kept walking. "Come on, cuff it up!" A gruff voice nearby growled low. "Let's just kill them already," another voice said, quieter and higher pitched. Sounds of weeping came in behind the voices. "Thieves?" The Black Knight turned in the direction of the commotion. The sound of a short cry and a thump on the cobblestones prompted him to quicken his pace. Should we kill the kid too? In the open space between two buildings, 3 men stood over a body. Beyond that, huddled the cowering figure of a child. Something triggered in him. Something new. His brow tightened as he stomped toward the 3 men, making sure his every step was as loud as possible. The men spun around, and 2 of them shuffled backward. Without thinking, the knight reached for his sword and spoke in the deepest voice he could muster. "Leave," was all he said. The thieves only hesitated for a second before they ran past him, crying in fear of the Black Wolf. As the footsteps of the 3 faded, the cries of the child at the end of the alley became more noticeable. The knight turned to face the young boy weeping over the body of his dead mother. He took 1 step toward the boy, then hesitated. This wasn't his problem. The boy looked up at him as he turned around to leave. "You should find your father." The child stood up, tears spilling over his face. I don't know my father. The knight turned back. Do you have anyone else? Another relative who'll take you? The boy dropped his head and shook it. No. I have family, but no one will take me. Mother's the only one who cared. I have nowhere to go either, the black wolf said softly. He knelt to meet the boy at eye level. By my actions, I have no one left who would trust me. But you saved me, the boy stated. That must mean something. The knight turned his head, lost in thought. He didn't know what to say or what to think. True, he did rush to protect the boy, but that didn't level out his sense of guilt. Not necessarily. He strode to the end of the alley and flagged down the first man he saw. Get the town guard. There's been a murder. The man's mouth dropped open. Yes, sir. He ran off across the market. The knight looked down and saw the boy still crying but trying hard not to. Hey, he broke the silence. There's nothing wrong with shedding a tear over a loved one. Men don't cry, sir, the child argued. Sure they do. Crying is a weakness, the boy almost shouted at him. The knight knelt down and spoke more softly. Showing emotions is not a weakness when bad things happen. You can still be strong no matter how many tears you shed. The boy wiped his face with his arm. Two men dressed in guard uniforms hurried into the alley. They stopped short and stared from the bloody corpse of the woman to the Black Knight and back again. 3 thieves killed this poor boy's mother. They ran off when I arrived. The older of the 2 guards scowled and turned to the boy. Is that how it happened? He nodded and stepped closer to the knight. The guards unrolled a blanket and wrapped the body. They picked her up and turned back to the end of the alley. Aren't you going to take the boy? The knight asked. We don't have time for street urchins. We'll take her to the churchyard for burial. They disappeared back out into the city. The knight didn't want to leave this child alone. He'd heard the story a great few too many times where children unattended would struggle to survive. They'd be forced into stealing food, picking pockets, sleeping rough. This boy would most likely end up like that. Come along, he said, marching to his horse. Sir? No child should be left to his own devices until he is wise enough and strong enough, he said. Do you want to become strong? Do you want to be brave? The boy took a moment, then nodded. Yes, sir. Then I've much to teach you. The knight led him out of the alley. And perhaps you can learn from my mistakes. They walked together through the busy streets to the stable where his horse waited. He stowed his supplies and hoisted himself into the saddle. The knight extended his hand downward, and the boy took it. He settled behind the knight and held on. Until you are a man, you shall be in the care of the Black Wolf. The knight shook the reins, and the horse took off. As they rode out of town, the knight smiled meekly under his helmet. Even though he failed the royal family, perhaps he could still fulfill his life's purpose by protecting one orphan boy.